All right, I'm glad to see there's so many people here. So we're gonna talk for a bit, and then I hope we can extend the discussion also to people in the audience. So, so it'll be a conversation that you can also have with, several, and not just with me. And I hope that many of you probably have seen already a soundtrack. Coup d'etat, which has played here and was played here yesterday, and was also been playing at Vega. And last year it was the opening film for the Mirage Film Festival, also. And you saw Dial History now, but I also hope you come back to see the other films and the rest of the program. And maybe some of this conversation will make even more sense if you know the rest of the works also. It's really nice to see it again. I mean, I feel like Dial History is a film that I see repeatedly, and we can come back to that. It's several reasons for that, and there's a lot to unpack. Not the least the attention to history and to kind of the span from international affairs to the kind of human or societal cost, you could say, that goes through many other works. But just to start off somewhere, I'm really curious on your ways of working, it's for you that have seen the soundtrack, then seeing Dial History, there's a kind of connection in terms of a formal approach, I think, of working with the kind of archives. The editing is really like a kind of critical and creative work for creating the film. Really, the attention to sound, music, and so on. There's quite a lot of parallels there. But it's not the only way you work, and we saw that also partly in the shorts and so on. And I guess I'm interested in a couple of things. One thing is like how you find your material and how you determine the form. So in Shadow World and so on, you're going into a very different way of working than this, you know, more into investigative journalism. And what made that the right way of working, for example, for that project? And if there's not necessarily that there's something the right way of working, but the way you wanted to work with that project compared to a soundtrack or this one.
Well, yeah, I don't know if people seen Shadow World, which is Michael Hart. A part of the Everyday Words Disappear film is in Shadow World, and you see how actually there's a lot of talking heads. But the talking heads are also treated in a way, there's a lot of B-roll, where we go back and forth, where you're silent. I always film also when they're actually listening to the questions, and that often the pensive mode of those talking heads, the moment they're not talking, is sometimes also part of the film. But the big difference between, for example, Shadow World, Double Take, Dial History, and soundtrack is that the collaboration was with a journalist, a politician turned journalist. The case of Shadow World, it was Andrew Feinstein, who had written the book Shadow World, who was an MP under Mandela. He was the economic advisor to Nelson Mandela in South Africa, and first-hand experienced the corrupt deal that was done with British airspace system, where the ANC was bought up for the elections to Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma, and Jacob Zuma was involved as well with the corruption. He exposed that and then had a follow-up deal with the Serious Fraud Office. But this became very much an investigative story. Sorry. Well, Dial History was a collaboration with Don DeLillo, and for example, Double Take is a collaboration with British novelist Tom McCarthy. And they're fiction writers, so the narration was taken from fiction novels. So you already have a different exploration of how the language of the specific documentary would come about. The soundtrack to Coup d'etat was a bit different, but the fact having worked through Shadow World, through the investigative elements, actually helped me a lot to make soundtrack to Coup d'etat more of a deeper story because of also the investigative element in relation to the dark story, a dark page out of the history of my country, Belgium. And so that was sort of crucial for that film. But while Daal History and Double Take is a collaboration with sort of fiction writing, soundtrack would sort of do that in the way the music becomes part of the film as a protagonist. I wouldn't say in the form, it is also in the form, but it extends the form, it extends the soundtrack. It's a soundtrack to Coup d'etat. It's where actually music steps onto the political stage and becomes a political agent, and as such becomes a protagonist. So that's very different. While in Daal History and Double Take had to do with commercials, with sort of the rise of the culture of fear, the beginning of the 60s, where a lot of cinemas were closing down, and so television is on the rise, and it's a dissection of sort of how the world was split between East and West and how fear was used as an element. In Daal History, it's sort of a bit different. It's also this trajectory and juxtaposition between how we come from the world of movies and the world of illusion and the world of dreams to the world of the catastrophe, to the world of television, to the world of how technology crashes. And so it's a different entry in how that story is told, but it tells it from, you know, the point of view of how those catastrophes or those hijackings or terrorist acts have been portrayed. And so I think there's a specific form for every film. I think soundtrack, because the music is so important, the journalistic endeavor with the weapons trade, and then Daal History because it's a meditation on television, but the extremities of television, and set against, while I was at the time traveling back and forth between Belgium and New York, where I was studying, saying goodbye, because initially it was first about a film about saying goodbye, and how the extremities of saying goodbye has become sort of, in a sense, has domesticated our body. Our bodies have become domesticated to fear. We step into a plane, but we're surrounded. We're labeled terrorists until not proven guilty. And so there's a different way of how, you know, with the 70s, 80s, 90s, as a kid born in the television world, how I wanted to give shape to.
So in Daal History, it was the material was already there. That kind of position, that thing of saying goodbye or traveling, as with fear, from the kind of history of news or history of the reporting of hijackings or.
It was still a research. You couldn't sort of video stream yet, but I punched in, for example, ABC News video source. I punched in the keyword hijacking, and then I get hundreds and hundreds of documents, and then we went to go look for them. It was not like found footage. It was really a research to go like look at trying to find all those images.
So you went to physical archives like that were not online.
Yeah, and I think I read everything I could possibly find on hijacking, and I had the whole list of every hijacking. From the first one was 1931, the first documented one, which is where a mail plane, a Pan Am mail plane, was hijacked over Peru, all the way to sort of the 50s, you know, the homesick Cubans, then the copycat Japanese Red Army who copycats Raul Castro, and then Leila Khaled who copies the Japanese Red Army. And then you have the Palestinian hijackings. Then it takes us up to the 80s, 90s, and then, yeah. And it's pre-9/11. That's also more remarkable. Yeah. It actually came out right before 9/11.
Yeah, just a few words. Because, I mean, the archive is really interesting. So in a way, you can get the material, if you can, in some projects, you get the material you need from the archives, right? But it's not solely that, because it's also these collaborations you talk about, either with writers that are contemporary, or musicians and so on, or you have been the investigative journalism where you are kind of creating new material, interviewing people, talking to people, having discussions about from basically creating material that wasn't there already, but puts the other aspects into context.
Well, to frame it for Daal History, You have to know, while I was flying, I always had my high 8. At the time, it was high 8. That's why it's so grainy material. But I shot for 5 years back and forth on the planes, like high 8 footage. And there's a lot of footage. I think it's about 30% is 40% is still like this high 8 footage, which I shot myself. All the very intimate home movies in Dahl history is my own material.
Yeah.
It looks like sort of it blends very well with the historical material, but you have all these little home movies, quirky things that I shot from television, commercials, and so that's one that was crucial. The collaboration with Don DeLillo is one with the writer, and then of course the collaboration with the musician.
It's because it was. I remember when I first saw it, when it first came in the late 90s. I guess it was like 97 when it came out, right?
Yeah. 97.
And
97.
it was almost as if it kind of connected or brought together so many different things out of media culture at that time that had been building for a while. You know, I mentioned it a little bit earlier when we were talking, like from the late 80s onwards, where kind of wars were narrated through a kind of TV video spectacle that hadn't been done in quite the same way. Like the resolution had gotten better, the streaming had gotten better, or so on. But it was also for me as a subject at that time, it was also connecting all this like TV and news footage that I've kind of grown up with, or at least the topics that I've grown up with, and maybe not actually seen the footage, you know, as I say, all the aspects of the Cold War, and so on. But there was something about the media culture in the way I experienced it, at least like in the late 80s, early 90s. It was you could say with like Dara Birnbaum's videos, like Tiananmen Square videos and so on. That were taking news and TV footage into art context, and maybe also in the film context. That seemed very actual, and it also seemed to come out of what to say, a kind of almost like do-it-yourself culture of that time, very politically focused also, and therefore that interest, I guess, in news and and I'm just wondering if you, I know you you'd been going between Belgium and New York, and you studied at the Whitney program and so on in New York, and so you had the context of a kind of quite politicized environment, like a politically focused environment, very aware of media and so on. What was the situation in Belgium at that time? Because I seem to remember the kind of media activists, and it might be bad memory, because maybe it was just you, but and the idea of zapping, and you know, moving through lots of different channels to find both this disrupt viewing, but also compose what you're seeing in different ways to create new context. Was there a particular kind of new media environment in Belgium that you were part of, or was it something else? Was it more?
Well, of course, the editing changed quite rapidly. You could actually at home start editing your own film. We did it here on Avid. But what was crucial for me was studying in the United States. You know, it was the beginning of the Iraq War, and that was for me a surreal shopping zone, seeing that actually television cameras were mounted on top of the missiles, and then they directly went into the war, and then when they actually, upon impact, they became white noise. And White Noise is another book by Don DeLillo that actually I quote here and there also in the film. But that being spliced with strawberry commercials. And that for me was very shocking. It was for me, maybe now it's not so shocking anymore, but at the time I thought it was such a weird sort of combination of things. And indeed at one point I started to study also zapping at one point, because you have to know zapping became very prevalent mid-80s. The proliferation of channels happened beginning of the 80s. Like when, for example, Ronald Reagan is inaugurated, and is the release of the Iron Hostages, which actually was planned, and this is maybe lesser known as the October Surprise, that actually he actually prevented that the hostages in Iran would be released during Carter's regime, because it would benefit him that they were actually arriving in the United States during the inauguration. This is the beginning of CNN. The CNN is getting big with immediately putting on the agenda the terrorist spectacle. I thought it was interesting. 9 months later, you have the beginning of MTV, and you see how the news, the CNN news specifically, is starting to style itself after MTV as well. There's this exchange of aesthetic codes, also exchange between Hollywood and TV. The aesthetic codes are being changed as well, because suddenly you have earthquake sort of cameras that mimic earthquakes that are being introduced into Hollywood, or also, you know, shaky cameras in a war zone or something. But you see 80s is a crucial juncture, because also terrorists is put back on the agenda, and also it's the proliferation of all these channels. And on top of that, before 1980, journalists went into the field with a Bolex camera. So the connection between, say, for example, images coming back from Vietnam and then being sort of developed, and then the impact later on, there was a delay. But like in the 90s when I was studying in New York, there was no more delay. It was live television of bombs going down into Iraq. While then, it's at the same time, it's more closer to war, but it's more opaque. It's more opaque, one, because it turns to white noise and you don't see the impact, but also second, the obfuscation with sort of this commercial zone between and after. And I thought it was very strange. Of course, you know, newscasts in the United States has always been paid. You know, CBS with Walter Cronkite was paid for by Camel cigarettes. But there is a bit of a switch with CNN, because suddenly you have news around the clock. And it's what they call drop-in style, that actually you could zap away, and hence comes the whole terminology of zapping, because you zap during a commercial break, and then you come back, you haven't missed a thing, because it sort of suffers from obsession. It's like every half hour you have a repetition in a very obsessive way, the same morsels of television news with the same commercials or different sort of commercials. And it's what Patricia Mellencamp would call obsessive behavior. It's sort of like the weapons of mass destruction as well. We'll be talking a bit later, of course. But they're being repeated over and over again until it turns into, that obsession turns into a reality. And for me, this was actually interesting to sort of analyze for Dahl history as well. Sort of hence also the commercials, the meditation and the poetry about this commercial zone as well. That you have images of death next to dog food, and for me it made sort of me thinking about zapping as an extreme form of poetry, and that's what I was working through. But the setup in essence is also, it's the terrorist versus the novelist, but it's also the filmmaker versus the image. And studying in New York and seeing television, I said, how can you add something still as a filmmaker to this whole image zone of television that is a never-ending sort of image? And so it's the filmmaker as a terrorist, or as what the situationists would call détournement, which is literally hijacking, but it's just the strategy of the situationists that you actually turn things around. And so I felt like I could identify with the hijacker, but also with the storyteller.
It makes me also think about how you work with archives then, and within the kind of media reality. If you look upon some of your work, which is looking at history also, and and I'm quite interested what you have to say about how you think about how you work with history and how an artist work with history. But the kind of media attention makes it quite different than, say, for example, another artist like a novelist would could work with like Sebald, for example, works with history, where you have the kind of slow kind of reveal of fragments. Slowly you start to understand this connection between the subjects in the novel and dramatic aspects of like recent history, or well, recent for me, like 19th century, 20th century history, and so on. And while in your work, it's faster, it's in your face, it's like and it uses also the kind of pop cultural vocabulary and commercial. So it's like there's information, historical news, just like what you're talking about now, I guess, that exists on the same plane as the commercial, and that's also represented in pop culture. So it's like these different media phases exist at the same time. But it also made me actually. I mentioned it earlier. You know, I was seeing things in dial history, for example, and also in the other works of yours. I see some material that I know and I've seen before, and I see a lot of material that I don't know, or didn't know. You know, and about historical happenings or occurrences or whatever, or situations today that I have heard about. And I was just thinking about artists, or you particularly, I guess, not general artists, but the working in relationship to archives, and if to recontextualize them, I guess, but also maybe to keep them alive somehow by recontextualizing them. So it's not necessarily to present the truth of the archive, but by interpreting and showing them and putting them back to viewers in a way that's very different than news. They get a different kind of cultural life. I don't know if you have any ideas around
But of
that.
course, history telling in a film is very different, of course, because instead of, maybe you say it's faster, but I think about it in layering. There's the layering, one vertical layering, that you have the music against the images, but you also have the text against the image, and also you have the juxtaposition between what comes before and after. So there's the layering can reveal history in a very different way than actually in a book, which is a linear sort of progressive way of dealing with history in say, an investigation. It's also called dial history, because when I plugged into ABC News or CNN or CBS or NBC, you know, it was like you dial in, and it's like you get access to history in a very different way. But to talk about history, I always refer to, you know, Voltaire, who says history is the lie we commonly agree upon, right? And so there's also something about the media spectacle that I thought was interesting to analyze. And to be more clear is that, for me, I think that the terrorist or terrorism, there was a voice. You see individuals in the beginning of the film. There's a transgression also, linear and historical way in the film, that Leila Khaled was still interviewed on television. Hijackers were still interviewed on television up till the mid-70s. And bit by bit you will see that, and then definitely towards the 80s, that actually the terrorist is being used to accommodate a bigger game. In a sense, that terrorism becomes a fig leaf to hide the big shit underneath. And it's today the same thing. You know, I'm with Howard Zinn, who says war is terrorism with a bigger budget. And you talk about Gaza, you know, there's terrorism being committed on such a grander scale, but it's being made opaque and obfuscated by actually labeling somebody a terrorist. And it's turning the labels upside down, in a literal sense. And with when I was working through Dal history, you know, you see once the image of the hijacker as a person, as a subject, disappears from the screen, and it was literally chosen like that. Mid-70s, 75, 1976, you have Entebbe, of which there's no images. This was the brother of Netanyahu, who was killed at the time. And they actually stormed the planes. And in Mogadishu, which was a joint Israeli and a German intelligence team, that actually stormed the Lufthansa in Mogadishu. And we talk in 1976. The day after, all the Red Army fractions, which was the militant left in Germany, were killed. And I say it again, they were murdered in prison. You know, people talked about suicide. But how can you commit suicide with a bullet in your neck if you don't have access to a gun? But there is a radical change, because the doctrine was adopted that shoot the terrorist on sight, one bullet in the heart, one bullet in the head, literally. I had all the bodyguard manuals that I was reading through, working through Dal history. And the second rule was, don't give terrorists any screen time anymore. So they disappear from television. But what's the big change is that suddenly you get state terrorism. You have the suitcase bomb. It's actually, for example, in 1986, when it's Mohammed is his name, a hijacker from the Baka Valley, whose mother and father, his family was being shelled, but actually the U.S. Enterprise, which was a U.S. carrier in front of Lebanon, shelling the village, the Baka Valley, Baka Valley in Lebanon, and he decided to hijack a plane between Beirut and Algiers. It goes back and forth. It's a TWA plane. And he shot one American, but the American happened to be a GI who actually worked. He was from New Jersey, but he was shot in revenge for the fact that his family was being shot. I'm not condoning violence, but what I'm trying to say is this feat of one American being killed on a plane was in the news on the front page for 6 months. While in the back of the New York Times, you have a footnote about 10,000, 20,000 people being killed in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Honduras, and it's only a footnote, but it's also terrorism. It's actually it's death squads, indirectly sponsored by the Reagan administration, that do exactly the same thing. And so what's happening is that this label of a terrorist is being used to hide another bigger game that actually cannot see the light of day. And so, of course, you can analyze that in a book, but for me, it was more in the way of working through images with the sensation, with the terrorist spectacle, and have here and there things that actually prick through that and show, like, trying to unmask what's going on. It's, of course, done in a more sophisticated way in Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat. I see this film as well, and I say, wow, this is like, it was like a raw. I was a beginning filmmaker. For me, it was very raw, trying to, as a filmmaker, what can you add to the world? It's like the world is full of messages, and then the world is full of this violence, and then what do you add to that? That was also a big question, this meditation on this. But did I answer your question?
and more, yeah. But again, I guess I'm going to let the thing about archives go. But I think you described yourself somewhere as making films from the debris of history, something like that. No?
Might have said that. I don't remember. No, but
I thought it was a nice image, in terms of like all the in your case, kind of media debris, like all kind of different aspects of like.
It's a collective memory as well.
Yeah.
And I always argue, because this film is about piracy, and this film has been pirated incredibly, but I also feel that it justifiable so, because, who are the big pirates? Is ABC News, CBS, and NBC, who actually have a corporate hold on our collective memory. While I think that should be a commons, I think the rules of fair use should be extended, that actually we have access to our collective memory. And I talk it more when I talk about Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat, when I talk about archives, because for me, I'm sort of already a little bit else with when I talk about archives, but I'd call them stolen kids. When you had mixed race kids in the Congo, they were illegal, they were not allowed and put in orphanages. And when independence happened, they were stolen by the Catholic Church and brought to Belgium. There's a huge discussion now about the stolen kids and the reparation of Congolese kids that never knew their mothers that were often raped. And there's a talk about reparation, but I feel often the archives are like stolen kids that actually need to sort of be recontextualized. And I think with James Baldwin that history is not the past. History is our present and what makes up how we are as we are. And it's the same with archives, that they're not history, they're actually free-floating signifiers that have to be reinvested each time again and again and again. And when you write history, you rewrite also the present, or you rewrite even the future. And for me, it's the same with the archives. It's in retrospect, through time, truth is also historical. I think history writing is historical. So it's something, and it's also something beyond me, because it's also, I feel, with the archives, these are markers that I have to also, I try to live through them and give them a new context, but I also try to listen what the world is trying to give. And of course, the world in the mid-90s was very different than the world we live in today.
Yeah, in many ways, yeah. And No, I also had this sense in soundtrack, definitely also that that history is part of our present, basically. And can you talk a little bit about soundtrack and how that came about? This also seems to be a kind of movement. I don't know if that's how you work, but seeing in the dial history, for example. You see kind of state terrorism shows up there, and kind of and the kind of threat of the hegemony of violence for the state, for the terrorists, and so on. You get some idea of weapons industry and so on. That then you shows up in other two films later on. Shadow World and so on, and so just wondering the kind of development into soundtrack. I mean, one thing is obviously also being Belgium and living in a society so shaped by the relationship between by the kind of colonial exploitation from Leopold and Belgium and so on. And I guess other artists and so on starting to question and do work around that, like Svein Augustin, for example, and I'm sure many others that I don't know about. But can you tell us a little bit about the start of that?
Yeah, well,
project?
Most of the films actually start from a very intimate sort of personal situation. Like Dial History came from living in New York, but my daughter and myself, we were all the time flying. I was a courier at the time for Halbar. You could fly for free, but you couldn't take any luggage. So I was flying every 3 weeks, and then my daughter came over to New York a lot. And so it actually grew out of this very intimate situation about always saying goodbye at airports. For soundtrack to Coup d'etat, of course, it's indeed being born in Belgium, and it's actually something that has seeped into the country, but is not unacknowledged. Unacknowledged in the sense of denial, right? And the history of Belgium is a very young country. It's like, and it's intrinsically linked. It's a country younger than France or United States, but its history is intrinsically linked to the DR Congo. And even the makeup, I live in Brussels, but you walk to Brussels, the layout of the city is the layout that Leopold II imagined. And it's all built with rubber money and chocolate money. And actually, it's blood money that actually seeped into the soil of Brussels itself. And so for me, it was crucial to sort of, after Shadow World, which is so much more about the defense industry, the war industry in relation to the United States. And it's not that maybe it's the United States, but for example, it's those big historical moments that actually shape very much the intimate moments of your life. You know, when you say goodbye, and I feel that's the same with sort of what happened with the Congo. You know, you grew up in Belgium, but you never question that a lot of your intimate imagery actually stems from that history. And so for me, it was time to dig into the backyard and try to work through that in essence. And that was, of course, the big part of the story of the film. But also, its point of departure was actually the shoe of Nikita Khrushchev. Because Nikita Khrushchev plays an important role in Double Take, where he functions as a Hitchcock doubleganger. But for me, also growing up the 60s and being a kid of the Cold War and being sort of European jam between East and West, without actually, inadvertently, it shapes your life so deeply that we actually are unaware. You know, it's also this whole rise of the culture of fear that intimately, you know, it shapes the way you think about the world. And the slamming of the shoe, I knew about the anecdote, but I never realized that slamming of the shoe had to do with Belgium. It was actually because of the Congo crisis, and Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, demanded that the UN Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, would resign because of his dealing in the Congo and his complicity, which I learned only afterwards, his complicity in the overthrow and being in the know also of the murder of Patrice Lumumba. We can talk about that because, you know, I know you're from Scandinavia, and in Stockholm it would even be more a fragile topic, because I get grilled a lot if there's a Scandinavian in the room. They always say, like, what about Dag Hammarskjöld? And so I have to say also Dag Hammarskjöld was murdered, and there was the complicity of the Belgians. But this is another story. It's the Susan Williams book, The Murder of Dag Hammarskjöld. Susan Williams was an advisor to soundtrack to Coup d'etat, but she also is the advisor now, together with the United Nations, opening the case into Dag Hammarskjöld, by the way. And if you read her book, it's case after case after case with evidence that actually Dag Hammarskjöld was killed. And it's in relation, again, it's in relation to what was going on, because he was trying to open up and still trying to give Patrice Lumumba and Joseph Kasavubu an opening to restart the parliament. Through actually upon advice from Dayal Rashasvar, who then became the advisor, the special representative, and then stationed in the Congo trying to actually get the parliament open. I'm deviating. I'm not answering to the question.
Yeah.
But you were asking about how the soundtrack to Coup d'etat came about. But the shoe was an important element. It was sort of the inciting incident that pushed me into the research and digging deeper and deeper, being surprised that actually it was Nikita Khrushchev who initiated the decolonization resolution, which has hardly been talked about in academic circles about decolonization, because this was it was then, of course, initiated by the Global South, because you have to have a sponsored country, and then as Resolution 1514 that was ratified 14 December 1960. But I say 14 December 1960 is quite crucial because it's the moment where Patrice Lumumba is then in prison. First he was in exile during the UN top, the 15th General Assembly, and then he was actually, but for me it's the flip side as well, that there's something untold and unspeakable, because it was also the end of empire. Subsequently to that, you have already 16 African countries being admitted to the United Nations General Assembly, which causes a political earthquake. It's the shift in the Global South where the majority vote is gained by the Afro-Asian bloc in the United Nations, which is very threatening for East and West. And all these things it was a learning curve for myself. But it started with the shoe, but then I dig deeper and deeper and deeper, and there was all these elements that I thought, wow, this is an interesting story. Because the 15th General Assembly happens 1 week after Mobutu overthrows Patrice Lumumba. And this is mid-September. The General Assembly opens 21, 22, 23. And I thought, wow, this is a flip side. And then, of course, the music. Finding out that Louis Armstrong was there at the same moment that actually the overthrow happened was also an eye-opener. So that was the way that also structured the film. You asked also before about, you know, how actually all those films differ, but it's finding the elements that actually will dictate how you actually shape the story of the film.
So in soundtrack, the involvement in terms of music also was different than in say in dial history, because the kind of implicity and complicity of music and musicians in these political structures were kind of already a character in the film.
But with dial history, there is something that was set forth as the research with David Shea. David Shea was a musician, and what I had in historical archival material, he had in samples as sounds. And so that was a very interesting collaboration. But we really thought about how one could juxtapose and have the music go against the grain of what the image shows. And this is something that I worked through in dial history that comes back in soundtrack to Coup d'etat, where, for example, Eric Dolphy is in essence the music that gives comment. This is during the independence ceremony where King Baudouin is giving a speech about Leopold II. It's the music that gives comments to, you know, the king's speech. And so there's where the music tips over into being very much a critical element and stepping onto the political stage, which is less, of course, in dial history.
That's interesting. Can you say something more about that, about using music against the grain of the image? This was one particular example. I can imagine, now I'm just making things up, but from having seen your films, just like, you know, something that's like a texture, more like a kind of, say, pop cultural or a commercial texture and sound put on top of something that's very kind of dire political or social observation. Or
well, let me take one example here from Dahl history. You have this David Hubbard, the psychoanalyst, who's an expert on skyjackers. And so he gives this Freudian analysis about, you know, he scares the woman, and so he sort of gets off on the fact that he actually scares a woman. But then immediately the scene afterwards, you hear "I'm Every Woman" from Chaka Khan. And so already in the music, you have a critical note towards what the psychoanalyst just coined as a phrase about, you know, the whole Freudian analysis of actually neglecting that actually Leila Khaled was also a hijacker. And so immediately afterwards, you see Chaka Khan, well, you hear Chaka Khan, "I'm Every Woman," and you see Leila Khaled. And so the music opens up another register that actually gives a comment to what you've just seen. But in soundtrack to Coup d'Etat, it's even, we really researched the way how one could push the political context of the music, because that was so crucial. And of course, they were used as black jazz ambassadors, while back at home they could not vote. They were second-rate citizens, but they had to represent democracy. And in itself, that's already very ludicrous and schizophrenic. But at the same time, trying to find how actually, even as a political instrument, Louis Armstrong was very much not a passive agent. And then Abbey Lincoln, or the other sort of side of the spectrum, as there's musicians, Abbey Lincoln, together with Max Roach, it's the Women's Rider Coalition. It's a woman as a musician that actually crashes the Security Council in this protest for Patrice Lumumba, and that's the other side. And it was, you know, it was really trying to listen to what's going on during those moments in the 1960s, what happened to the music, or the rumba for that matter. You know, the rumba, Patrice Lumumba is released from prison, is flown over to Brussels, and he's accompanied by African jazz and Joseph Kabasele, and on the spot they compose Independence Cha-Cha, and the music is always very close to the political scene. And the Independence Cha-Cha became then a very important anthem across the continent of Africa, so much so that it became the name of the Liberation Party in Rhodesia, in former Zimbabwe. And so I could not sort of take that on as a way of juxtaposing the language each time. You know, there's also Rosa Guy, so the Women's Rider Coalition, Maya Angelou, the writer, and Rosa Guy, the playwright. You see her at the end of the film screaming. And then we actually added the scream of the We Insist Freedom Now album of Max Roach, where Abbey Lincoln is literally present also during the Security Council. And so the music opens up that register of adding another layer to the images. Yeah. So it's very much present in the soundtrack, but it's already announced in Dahl history for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think it's really interesting because it's also has the effect of I don't know, disrupting the conventions of the image or the sound, the image you see or the sound that you hear, you know, and creating a different kind of space of experience. And that's only interesting when it's in relationship to something specific. So say to the political narration or the personal narration and so on. But then that's really, really interesting because that kind of brings the viewer into kind of one thing, you compose something different, but it's also kind of temporary blind spot almost. Yeah.
But also I believe that it opens the cinematic space as well.
Yeah.
Like the most boring way of telling a documentary is talking heads. Because it's so easy to have a talking head explaining what's going on. But if you let the material speak for itself, then you have to try to find a way where you open that up. And that's through the juxtapositions, the juxtaposition between the intimate footage and sort of the historical images. But you have to look for opening that cinematic space through poetry, which is a very different way of actually telling the story. And I think for me, that's where the cinematic space, the third space, opens up, and it's so much more interesting storytelling. On top, it actually leaves openness for, if you don't explain what's going on, it leaves openness to actually have a different reading of what's going on as well, or even contradictory readings. With a talking, explaining head, you hardly have that. Or they have to talk in contradictions or in jokes, but...
Yes. Yes, already. Okay. Well, do we have a...
Without the microphone, I suppose. Yeah?
Yeah, or is it...
And then we speak loudly. kind of you. Thank you. I would like to commend you on your way of connectivity, because I think that's one of the reasons why we are here in life, that is to understand the connections in the world. And then particularly in your last film, I found that very fruitful. But I was thinking about how you got across some of the new things that we didn't know. For example, the Maya Angelou-led invasion into the Security Council, which is a very new thing to me, and I've studied a lot of African American history. And then again, if you see that unspoken getting spoken, and you connect that to the film where you're inspired by Godard's film, I was thinking, because there is much about the oppression of language and the way in which your filmatic language opens up, and you also use the expression of love, almost spoken at least, in that short film. I just see some kind of weird connectivity between Everyday Words Disappear and your fight against the disappearance. And my final, this is perhaps more a comment, but my question would be, how has your film been received in Belgium? And I was thinking, when you went to school, how little did you learn about the history that you now unraveled?
Well, to quickly answer the last question, indeed, I didn't learn that at school. We were still taught that Leopold II was a good civilizer. And actually, yeah, and still today, they say, you know, he was getting rid of the slave dealers, which were Arabs. And so he was actually saving the Congolese from the Arab slave owners, which is another sort of poor alibi to actually steal the country empty, in a sense. But how was it received in Belgium? Actually, there is something that is moving because of an influx of an Afro-P community, African European community in Brussels. It premiered at Matonge, which is the Congolese neighborhood, together with Mama Maridon and Collège Jean Bofane were all there. The whole community was there. And so that made a huge splash. And then you have to know that for a long time in Belgium, Congo was out there. The othering happened across the sea. It was l'Empire du Silence. Othering in the United States happened within. And the articulation, I don't want to romanticize that, but the articulation was very much part of society. And so it's close by. So you cannot sort of, even if you try to deny it, it's in your face, right? And there is it speaks back even through body language. But in Belgium, we didn't have to deal with it because it was out there. And so for a long time, it was unspeakable, until Adam Hochschild's book, The Ghost of Leopold II, was published in the 80s, who was an advisor to the film, that something shook up. And, you know, nowadays they're still talking, is it a genocide? They're trying to define what is a genocide instead of actually admitting to the cruelty that happened. But it played for 8 months in the cinema, so a young generation was really going with it, and there was very good press, except for the far right. And the monarchy is silent, but I think it's strategic, because they went to the Congo 2 years ago. You have to know the tooth of Patrice Lumumba was repatriated only 2 years ago. This is crazy. This is like, and the apology, which was not really an apology, was wishy-washy. That the parliament said, let's say we regret instead of we're sorry. But if you say we're sorry, means there's consequences, and you admit to a crime, and there's reparation. And so they said we regret. And so this is an ongoing discussion. That's why also at the end of the film, of soundtrack to Coup d'etat, which we didn't see, I just pretend that as we've seen it. But at the film ends with that the Belgian government was complicit with the assassination, and they were. And that's still sort of not really out there. But you know, that's why I added all the page numbers and the cable numbers, that I knew I would get grilled in Belgium. But the press was with me, actually. They really went with it. Your first question about... I have to apologize, because I think we, as in the studio, didn't send Everyday Words Disappear with the translated French. And the French supposed to be translated as well. There's one thing about the love, I have to say. We actually wanted Michael Hart set against Laurent Berland, who's a scholar who also writes about love, because love is, and Michael Hart says that well. It's a perverted term, right? It's been corrupted. And as Hannah Arendt says, you know, you marry love with politics, you get fascism. And so it's very tricky to talk about love because it's a very generic term, and it's big themes. But he tries to be very precise. But I also think there's something of an intimate world that belongs to love that you cannot politicize. So there I feel, but that was sort of, you could find in the Alphaville sections, where indeed, you know, where everything about affections has been sort of written out of society. And I do believe we're tending towards a society where a lot of things are not speakable anymore, or even gestures, or you name it, COVID, you name it, you know, social distancing, mask, etc., etc., etc. There's something that I feel that we should sort of redefine. And it's also working through Shadow World, which is about the arms trade, because everyday words disappear, and also Raymond Tallis, they were all part of the diplomatic section. And you have to know the amount of diplomats that the United States has is smaller than the personnel to actually operate an aircraft carrier, meaning that diplomacy has been completely atrophied. And you cannot solve like a war like Ukraine in a couple of days with a couple of points. This is a skill. This is a skill where you have to study, will both parties agree? You go talk to the parties, you actually make negotiations, etc., etc., etc. And so our skills of diplomacy also have atrophied. But I think it's much deeper. It's so much more perverse. It's like even all the images that we learn as kids about how boy meets girl, boy meets boy, or girl meets girl, they meet they, that actually we learn that through commercials. And so it's a corporatized sort of language of how we deal with love as well. But we could go on and on and on about. But I think it's a crucial dialogue to have.
Thank you very much. It's been very interesting to see. I also like your short films, which have this anecdote quality. But I have two questions. One is about your collaborations, and the other is more about the aesthetics. The first question is about Dial History is one of my favorite films, but this is the first time I've heard you, because you are the director, but you keep calling it a collaboration with Don DeLillo. But I wonder what a collaboration is for you. At first I thought it was just you're using quotes from an author. But can you say something more general about how you collaborate, let's say, with Don DeLillo, Tom McCarthy, perhaps Michael Hart, Laurent Berlant, this collaboration issue? The other question has to do with your aesthetics. I don't like it when people call you a video artist. For me, you are more of a filmmaker. And it's very interesting to hear the way you say how television sort of challenge you as a filmmaker. You have to invent a new language. And then I see two filmmakers, in especially like Hitchcock and Godard, keeps coming back in your filmmaking, so to speak. Reminds me a little bit of Godard's own L'Histoire du Cinéma, where he also refers to Hitchcock. So I wonder what role these characters play with regards to how you sort of try to create art out of this horrible situation we're in. What's the role Hitchcock and Godard plays to you, and perhaps a reflection on L'Histoire du Cinéma, if you have. Thank you.
Well, I don't know if you've seen Double Take. Double Take is staging two Hitchcock characters who talk to one another, and then there's a third one which is a lookalike, which is a real double-ganger. But you have to know that the premise of Double Take is very much Hitchcock crossing over to television. So he crossed over from England to Hollywood, from talkies, from silent film to talkies, from black and white to color, but he also crossed over to television. And that was for me crucial in this Double Take, because it's as I said, it's very much a meditation on the rise of the culture of fear through television, where cinemas were closing down. And you have to know that, for example, there's a back and forth also between TV and Hollywood, where he would take his crew of his television crew to make Psycho. And that's why it's black and white, and that's why he was cheap, and he was very mobile, and that's why he killed Janet Leigh 20 minutes in, because of the commercial break. this was unheard of. I'm not making this up. It's unheard of that actually your biggest asset, that is the biggest part of your budget, that you actually kill it off in the first sort of moments of the film. And people were that's why he also stressed that everybody should be in the film from the beginning onwards, because you would get that surprise of the main protagonist being killed early on. But I'm diverting. So again, it's not so much that Hitchcock, of course, the vocabulary of cinema, but also that he very much shaped also the way vocabulary of television came about, and that's maybe less known. That he was joking with the commercials, that he was playing on the riff of the double ganger, but also TV as a double ganger of cinema, and so on and so on. And hence the Borges story as well. Now, the collaboration, I had a talk with Tom McCarthy 2 days ago, actually. We were talking again through all of Double Take and then through his recent novels. And the collaboration with Tom McCarthy grew over a long span of time. He was present during a Dahl history screening at the British Film Institute, where he went on about sort of the dramatic triangle between the hijacker and the hostages and the media. And he called that the Greek dramatic triangle. And hence we had been having conversation on and on and on. I asked him then for a book to rewrite the Borges meets Borges story for a little short story, and then became the template for Double Take. But I did not have so much, because you have to know there's the intimate conversation between Hitchcock and Hitchcock, but it's doubled by actually the kitchen debate or the politicians having debates as well. And so the Cold War becomes sort of a double ganger for the intimate conversation, because the first line in this that Tom McCarthy wrote is that if you meet your double, you should kill him, otherwise he will kill you. And the stand of the Cuban Missile Crisis, of the kitchen debate between Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev, was very much a similar standoff. So there's also, again, the intimate story against the political story, which is a Hitchcock sort of strategy as well, like in North by Northwest. You know, the love interest is prevented to get together because you have the Cold War spy story, and then two stories, the love story comes together with the political story on the nose of the president, preferably a national monument, where there's the standoffs and the climax between the two stories, the intimate story and the political story. But I didn't have so much the political story. I had a snippet of the kitchen debate between Khrushchev and Nixon when Tom McCarthy came to visit me, and we spent the whole weekend trying to carve out the story for Double Take. And he said, you know, he noticed that the kitchen debate, said, why don't we make the kitchen debate similar to Hitchcock meeting Hitchcock and elaborate on that? And that's where the structure of Double Take fell into place. It was less with Don DeLillo. With Don DeLillo was emailing back and forth, and then he suggested maybe he would have preferred an Arab female voice for the terrorist. But then it's actually an African-American voice. And he could not find himself in that, because he's, of course, the writer's embodying him, Don DeLillo. And Don DeLillo doesn't have that background. But it wouldn't have been much different with an Arab female voice than an African-American voice. But that was mainly emailing, and then the approval afterwards, and then some changes, etc., etc. So it was less an in-depth collaboration than with, say, Tom McCarthy. With Andrew Feinstein, with Shadow World, that was really intense because we did all the interviews together. And it was, the basis was his book and the premise was his book as well. Is this a part that I forgot, or?
Thank you. You mentioned Lumumba and Max Roach. As a jazz musician, possibility of listening to American musicians in the around 1960 was to go there, and you had to go by boat to be a sailor. On the way, the map was registering how we were running towards the States, but also the telegraph messages and news about the developments in Congo. So in a way, going to the map and looking at this was a very important aspect of encountering the world at sea, so to speak. But when I came to New York, I was listening to Ornette Coleman at his opening stage at 5 Spot, with the free jazz revolution, of course. But in 5-spot, the first thing that I could observe was a guy sitting at the drums alone. And it was Max Roach. And he was drumming and drumming and drumming and drumming. People were standing beside because they were expecting this Ornette Coleman quartet to arrive soon. But so they were in a way talking a little, and Max got enormously angry. He rose up, threw the sticks towards the bar, and shouted, "Silence, silence, I'm praying for the world." Then came Ornette Coleman. Now this was just a glimpse of the kind of connection between Lumumba and Max Roach in person.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story. And he was very much an activist, Max Roach.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, when he says, you know, we use music as a weapon for the dehumanization of what's going on in the world, he meant it, yeah. Thank you.
Sort of a question about editing, but not about the technicalities of editing. It just struck me watching your films, which have so much power and poetry that come through the way you edit images together. It just hit me that we're seeing that in a week when editing has become extremely politicized. I'm thinking about the President of the United States threatening to sue the BBC for one single edit of a speech. And in fact, NRK and other broadcasters now frantically re-editing their documentary coverage of various political happenings. Does that make you wonder? It just made me wonder, are we going to be entering an era where to edit and to construct stories through edits is going to be kind of pushed more into the realm of, or to be accused of creating fake stories instead of trying to reveal truth by editing, which is what I think your work is trying to do? Is that something that is going to perhaps make you rethink or evolve your approach to editing and constructing film?
Yeah, it was always there. Huh? It was the whole sort of manipulation of media was. I just explained about the Latin America, and then what was on the front page of the New York Times. That was always there, making things visible at the same time opaque. But the difference is that we have the technological tools that actually can exacerbate what actually is being spun as a lie. And so there's I think a couple of weeks back, you know, there was a little AI video of Trump throwing out Obama of the White House, but it was completely generated AI, but it looked so real. You know, you have even with speech programs, you can completely, if you have a little snippet of a phrase of somebody, you can completely concoct a speech of somebody who actually did not say what you can create with the speech app. So I think the tools have changed. That, you know, I think the context will become even more and more important. So the context of what does it mean? I don't know, because, you know, at one point I was joking that actually, you know, Super 8 meant childhood, or VHS meant sort of more of a different sort of, not childhood, but more catastrophic sort of 80s. And then you go on and on, the noise becomes sort of coded with sort of a historical layer. But even that will be faked, right? You can even add in your Premiere, you can add sort of dust, which is 60 millimeter dust, or you can add different sort of dust. So I don't know, I have to work through that, because that's the next project as well. I'm working through these ideas of consciousness. You saw Raymond Tallis talking about how consciousness is relational, but I also do think that truth is relational. It's in a sense, because we share truth, that it's made verifiable through sort of, if you have a court case, it's through witnesses, right? So I think truth is also relational, that maybe will become more and more important. But also I think historical material will become more and more important, original material. So the archives, because we can generate more, I think the originals will become even more precious. But I don't know, I would love to try to, or love to work through all these themes of artificial intelligence created imagery, and what does that mean, you know? It's like with Virilio as well, has said, you know, with virtual reality, reality has become accidented. And it's not that actually, you know, media had to catch up with reality, now reality has to catch up with media. It's really an upside down world. So, but I don't have any, as I said, you know, I'm trying to make sense of the world as well. And it's an ongoing process, so I don't know where it will lead me. But yeah, it's very much on topic, and it's very crucial. Yeah. But I think I believe that when I teach, I always go back to dialogue, and in the sense of preventing to sort of objectifying the other, in the way open up the dialogue as sort of Martin Buber do and I, that instead of saying he or she or they, which objectifies the other, and the othering is making the other possible through the dialogue. And I think that's crucial, and that's going to become more and more crucial. And there's again this aspect of community and how we stand in the world together, because that will become maybe even more important. And then we have to develop our consciousness skills and become telepathic individuals, etc., etc. Okay.
So thank you very much, Johan.
Thank you.